Hello everybody, we are so back. In August 2024, I released this video. It covers the discovery and playthrough of the worst map I'd ever found in Dwarf Fortress. If you have not yet seen that video, I'm going to be talking about a lot of concepts and things that happened in that video in this video, because this is kind of a sequel to it. The last video took place in a location known as the Heavenly Tundras. It is an area that is both good and evil, with the good being on the ground and visible to the player, and the evil being in the sky somewhere and having bad effects on the player without any warning. The good is pretty benign. Not much really happens there. Animals come and go, and there's some funny plants, if you can see them beneath the thick layers of snow. However, the evil sky layers of the biome rain this stuff called abominable smoke. Any living thing that comes into contact with it suddenly becomes opposed to life and wishes to see it ended as swiftly as possible. And they constantly secrete the stuff and spread it around as they move about the map, meaning they're essentially playing Tron, and if you touch those lines, you become one. Because all you need is this goo to get in contact with your skin, and zap, there you go, you're one of them. So essentially, existing on this map is like playing a very dangerous game of tag. There's no notification when the rain starts, and it covers the entire map, mostly, from what I can tell. And if it happens to be raining when you decide to settle, that's an instant game over. Oh, I should also mention, there's titans all over the map for some reason, which are these randomly generated hell monsters. We'll talk a little bit more about those when we get in game, and yes, they can also become zombified. Once you become an abominable smoke zombie, you continue to live, in air quotes, which means any dwarf who's turned will still be able to gain skills. This means they can train up and become legendary soldiers. They can also equip weapons, they can name weapons, and become unstoppable super monsters. For those of you unfamiliar with how Dwarf Fortress works, the saves are often compatible, but new features are added from time to time that change the way the world generation works. So since I last played this map, there have been several seismic changes to Dwarf Fortress. Some of them affect this map and others do not. There's been some rebalancing, including the removal of the underground hordes. These were little raiding parties that would attack you from the cave levels. Currently in the game, they're permanently disabled. At least their respawning is. Sometimes you still see the occasional ones, but they will not enter the map from the edge and attack you with unstoppable hordes, like previously. And because this map location doesn't have any metal, it's going to be very, very difficult for me to actually survive here, because I won't be able to melt down the spears and shields left behind by the frogmen, or the rodent men, or the Olm people. Canonically, in the world's history, this attempt takes place just after the events of my last fortress in this world, which was known as Gortusk. Gortusk was a fortress of religious zealots, and had quite the tale of its own. I'll leave a link in the description if you'd like to give it a look later. The fortress, in the I played the worst map in Dwarf Fortress history video, Godly Tombs, is still present. In fact, it is right here. It's this red square. Even though every single dwarf from that map is now dead, one location has become populated with dwarves since the destruction of that fortress. Probably some caravan that got lost on its way to attempt to trade. In some ways, this video is going to be a sequel to the previous fortress, me attempting a similar challenge that I've attempted before. In other ways, this is a complete redo, because it's going to be in a new map. There will still be the same psychotic map, problems, and hazards on the surface alongside of the titans from before, but the titans will be different, and the threats from below will also be quite different. So I'm hoping there will be more threats from the surface this time. This will be an opportunity for me to see if it's possible to recreate the heroes of old, and to see if the changes made to the game in the last year make this map harder or easier, or perhaps challenging in a new and exciting way. Welcome back to the Heavenly Tundras, and allow me to introduce the fortress of Strange Tomb, the home of many doomed dwarves and doomed threats, a place that many dwarves will enter and none will ever leave. It's good to be back. The embark for this fortress was pretty standard. I made sure most of my dwarves had some skill in mining, and I brought some extra pickaxes. I wanted to be able to get underground as soon as possible. And because I knew that the map wasn't going to have any metals, I also brought a lot of iron ore with me. This would allow me to quickly make steel, and get at least some defenses in the underground areas of the fortress. And as I was becoming acquainted with the new environment that I was now going to be settling in, very quickly it became clear that I'd made a grave mistake. Because it turns out, the first time around I got very lucky. Where I settled, we didn't get rained on right away, and we had enough time to get underground. But unfortunately this time around, things did not go as planned, and this wouldn't be the first or only attempt at starting this fortress. It would be one of many. But I had no idea what I was in for, so I began building some walls. And I set a pasture for my livestock, several dogs and yaks. I was planning to keep the yaks around as livestock, and train the dogs as some additional defense. And as quickly as the fortress had began, the fortress ended. It was sudden, and also rather unexpected. So I did the same thing that any normal video game enjoyer would do. I crashed the game and tried the process once more, but I decided to embark slightly to the right of where I had embarked previously, hoping that the weather patterns would be different. So after I painstakingly recreated everything in the Prepare Carefully screen, I clicked that Embark button, which included a brand new set of 7 dwarves. The process began as it did before. In fact, I even looked at some of the titans, just to see what was different. After getting my fill, I made a burrow to keep the dwarves from wandering away and becoming zombified, but it was no use. The same result as before. I was beginning to panic. I really wanted to complete a second fortress in the same area as the last one, but even just the simple act of embarking has already proven significantly more difficult. But it doesn't matter how many attempts it takes. I will make this work eventually. Something definition of insanity and all that. But no matter how many mistakes I would inevitably make, sometimes I do make good decisions. Before that last embark, I actually saved the profile, meaning instead of having to painstakingly recreate everything for the next embark, I simply need to load the profile from the last attempt. And I also created a hard save after embarking on the second attempt, meaning I could simply reload and try again, or alternatively try somewhere else on the map if it fails too many times. And perhaps unsurprisingly, it did fail many times. So I decided to take advantage of that profile that I'd saved and embark in a slightly different location once more. But this time, moving the embark tile slightly south. And I used that profile that I had saved. This one was even shorter than the last one. The second I unpaused the game, it swiftly ended. So I decided to attempt embarking a little bit further north. At this point, I was getting doubtful I would be able to even get this playthrough going, so I decided to let the game run a little bit and see how long it would take for the rain to kick in, or something horrible to happen. The result? About 30 seconds. But I was hopeful, so I began the process again. I crashed the game, reloaded the world, let the calendar catch up, and embarked. But this time, it ended even quicker. That's not good news. Maybe I didn't have as much leniency as I thought. When there's a will, there's a way, and we try, and try, and try again. Surprisingly enough, this attempt didn't even get rained on. Simply a infected reindeer ran into the crowd and started biting people. This caused a pretty rapid snowballing effect where one of my cats got infected. I'm not even sure why it was there, to be honest. And moments later, the rain kicked in and everybody else died. Do I even have a hope in hell to getting this going? Well, obviously I do. Look at the runtime of this video. I mean, don't actually, because then you'll close it. I want you to fall asleep, so I get the maximum runtime. I was beginning to feel like I was stuck in Groundhog Day, watching this calendar tick by once more. The overworld map in front of me, glaring at me, mocking me. But thankfully, I still had the soft reminder that I had an embark profile ready and waiting for me. I've skipped this in the last few attempts, but the only thing I actually need to do for these attempts is to set the name as Strange Tombs and the local dwarven government as the Strangled Weasel. And I actually managed to screw that up. I dropped the S somewhere in one of those failed attempts, but things were beginning to look up. I was able to get my walls constructed, I got my burrow built, prepped and ready for a wall and then a roof on top of the wall. I assigned the dwarves to it, and then I actually saved the game. I was getting really hopeful here, and thinking that things would work out. So I continued on my merry way. I moved the burrow underground as well, and designated the initial area for the dwarves to dig, and they quickly got to work. And if you're wondering why I brought these blue blocks with me, these are made out of a material called jet. Because it is one of the lightest materials in the game, I was hoping it would help speed up the construction process. And this is where things quickly went south. If you notice, the population just dropped by 1. Well, someone's just been turned, and it's baffling to me as to why. But unfortunately for the miner, Asob, they are now an abominable smoke zombie, just like me on April 20th. The 6 other dwarves managed to hack Asob to pieces, leaving her in shreds on the ground. But she'd managed to infect one of my dogs in the process, so time was limited for the rest of the dwarves. Quickly things snowballed, and the fortress ended. But thankfully, I had that save, so I simply reloaded the game. I wasn't entirely sure what had happened, so I figured I would let things play out the same way as before. I unpaused the game and set my animals to the pasture. But things played out almost exactly the same. Suddenly infections spread, and one by one the dwarves ripped each other to shreds. Ironically, this time the final dwarf was Asob, who became the expedition leader, and in a fit of panic was running as fast as her little legs could carry her away from the fortress, but quickly turned back around time returning to the fortress. And this was important, because it helped me figure out exactly what was going on. You see that? Right there. Yes, right there. She walked up the ramp, and that was the second that the fortress ended. Is it perhaps not raining on layer 48? But it is raining on layer 49, so as long as the dwarves don't go on top of the wall, we could be safe. With this new knowledge in my mind and this theory ticking away, I reloaded the save file. And this time, I deleted the ramp in the corner of the construction. I assigned all of my animals to a pasture in the middle, and I let the dwarves get to work. I also made sure that my burrow was up and running, and selected an area for the dwarves to begin digging. But if you notice right here in the corner, right before I designated the digging, one of my dwarves decided to climb, for some stupid reason. And as I was blissfully designating away off in the background, that dwarf was on the wall, becoming a zombie, and quickly turned one of my dogs into red paste, and infected one of my yaks, and 3 of the 6 remaining dwarves. We did have this hilarious moment of Bumrek here trying to handle this zombified yak into a pasture, but unfortunately things wouldn't end so well for them. We also had Asobs skipping away along the bottom here, already zombified once again, and ready to eat whatever walks. This time, I didn't even let things play out. I just quit without saving. I knew what I needed to do. Don't let the dwarves get on top of the wall. For any reason. So I reloaded the save file, deleted the corner once more, set up my burrow, and at this point, I was feeling confident, so I began redesigning my walls slightly to look a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. And the dwarves got to work, and almost immediately, I panicked. There goes Bomrek, jumping onto the wall. For what felt like an eternity, Bomrek sat on top of that wall. I double-checked the restricted burrows to make sure that they were in fact in effect, and they were. I wasn't sure why the dwarf was standing in such a dangerous spot, but moments later they jumped down, and I was able to finish building the outside of the wall.
Woo!
And informed the dwarves that it was time to dig underground some more, and they swiftly got to work. Once underground, I set up a few stockpiles for food and objects, and made a carpenter's shop so that I could build a hatch cover and lock the dwarves underground for good. Quickly, the dwarves unloaded the wagon. They didn't have much distance to cover, and I got that hatch cover installed. As the dwarves finished unloading everything from the wagon, I deleted the last pasture, and expanded the stockpiles so everything would fit. And the moment the wagon was deconstructed, I locked the hatch cover. Success. As the dwarves were unloading the wagon, something peculiar was happening. You may or may not have noticed this, and even I was confused by it. There is moss growing here. For those of you who don't know, moss grows in cavern layers, which are the lower, deep cave levels beneath the fortresses. Once released, the moss then spreads around the local maps, covering all blocks that contain dirt or mud. This allows animals who need to graze to be able to graze underground. This is a very important tool in Dwarf Fortress, especially for surviving in these evil biomes. But I hadn't dug into any caverns yet, so where could this moss be coming from? My only theory, and I guess the one that I'm running with, because it's the only thing that makes any sense, is because I settled directly next to a fortress that I've built previously that definitely broke into every single cavern layer, the game just considers this close enough to give me cavern moss. You learn something new every day. Fascinating. A very large herd of reindeer had been zombified, and were doing their best to draw some intricate patterns in the snow. But I had some intricate patterns to draw myself. I needed airlocks, or decontamination chambers, and long tunnels connecting them to the central fortress. Otherwise, there was no chance traders or any dwarves would ever make it into the fortress when they decide to migrate here, which can happen a couple of times per year, so we had to be quick. So I told the dwarves to dig 4 tunnels, leading to the 4 corners of the map, with stairs leading to the surface. This was of course kind of a rough design idea that I was going to expand upon as things went on. After setting up all of those instructions for the dwarves, I also informed them that they should hollow out an open space. We'd need somewhere to put workshops. And thanks to this moment of relative safety, I have the opportunity to examine my titans a little bit. These one-of-a-kind, randomly generated creatures live inside of shrines, which can be spotted by the little structures on the overworld map while we were embarking. Normally, they are hidden in the overworld, but you can discover them in adventure mode. Now, it is very rare to find so many of them in such a small space. I presume it has something to do with all of the mountains in the region, because shrines can only appear on flat plains during world generation. They're also the cause of the evil biome, which is, well, you know, making the zombies and all that. This map has 5 shrines on it, but there are only 4 titans. The first of which is Landlar, Packmoss, the Hill of Snakes, which is a gigantic 3-eyed bunting. It has large mandibles and it moves about carelessly. Its russet feathers are long and sparse. Beware its webs. A terrifying creature, boasting many kills. The second is Amser, strapped drums, the windy blossom. This one is a gigantic scaly giraffe with 4 long spiral horns. It has an austere look about it, and its lavender scales are blocky and close set. Beware its deadly spittle. And while these creatures are aesthetically terrifying and gigantic, they also show their power. Scattered about are skeletons and suits of armor. These are the creatures who were recently silly enough to attempt to end one of these beasts. Or perhaps were simply unlucky enough to encounter one during its travels, only to have their remains collected in this gruesome pile. Oftentimes, you can see their names written in their list of kills, a grim sight to be sure. Standing here is Lolama, Forest Snarls, the turquoise, a gigantic one-eyed theropod. It has a curling trunk and a regal bearing. Its mahogany feathers are patchy. Beware its poison bite, and pity those who lie before it. And one could never forget a sight such as Thamayi, Tulip Spray, the Meadow of Berries, a great humanoid composed of coral. It has wings and it moves about carelessly. Beware its webs. Creatures with webs are known to be lethal threats to anybody who's unfortunate enough to move into close quarters combat with them. When I embarked here, I was expecting a 5th Titan. However, their shrine is empty, which leads me to believe that they've been killed elsewhere, or were simply out traveling when I decided to embark here. Perhaps they'll return someday. And as I was musing on thoughts of shrines and titans of old, a great horned owl flew by, infested with abominable smoke. Little did the dwarves know, they were underground and taking nicknames, such as Founder the Expedition Leader. And honestly, it makes sense that this dwarf decided to lead this party on what is ostensibly a no-return trip, because she has a strong tendency towards privacy, and is incredibly brave in the face of looming danger. Frankly, this dwarf seems like they are the best possible candidate for the job. And jobs it was. After all, there's a lot of work to do, and the dwarves had only just begun digging those tunnels. But even a few layers down where they were digging in the rock, they could hear something screeching. It was that owl that I spotted before. It had decided to attack Asmer the Windy Blossom, who quickly ripped that owl to shreds. But in the process, Asmer was covered in abominable smoke, turning them into a smoke zombie, which simply makes the Titan an even more formidable threat. Terrifying. And as the soft squelch of the owl being crushed was finalized, another creature challenged a Titan. This time it was a great bald eagle, oozing liquid smoke. And the result was very similar. It was struck down and crushed into tiny little pieces. And moments after, Lolma, the great Titan, became one with the smoke. Patterns of dangerous ooze etched the surface as creatures meandered about. Some with wings, others with hooves, and some of them reminiscent of times long past. Not that the dwarves really cared. They had holes that needed digging, and doors to construct, and drawbridges that could be raised, so that they could at least have some hope of getting new migrants into the fortress when they arrive, as well as traders and anybody else who they wish to welcome into the bowels of this place. They also had an aquifer that required a lot of attention. They needed to chisel their way through and smooth the walls. I also stumbled upon the caverns. The first of several, I'm sure. Meanwhile, the brave dwarf Ficod, known as Snail, was instructed to dig a ramp up to the surface to open up the first of many airlocks. The process was smooth, and once I finished updating my restricted burrows, things continued smoothly. I then moved on to tell the dwarves to install some more drawbridges where the next round of airlocks were going to be installed, at the very top end of the map. But the tunnels weren't even half finished, so we still had a ways to go. Back on the surface, the Titan smoke zombie was beginning to rampage. At least somebody was going to be a cleanup crew for all of the zombie reindeer. Back down in the caverns, I ordered the dwarves to begin carving out some of the space in the middle, because most of it appeared to be filled with aquifers, just so that we had somewhere to allow our animals to graze that wasn't so close to the front door. And yes, the caverns would provide some initial shelter, but it wouldn't solve all of their problems. If they made too much noise down there, forgotten beasts might get curious, and of course the wild animals lurking below would also take notice. But in all of the rush of getting the fortress put together, the dwarves had forgotten a very critical detail. It was early autumn, and it was time for the first caravan to arrive. The dwarves hadn't even constructed a trading depot yet, and none of the airlocks were ready for operation. Perhaps they'd been too ambitious with the initial designs. A grim reminder of winter hardships to come indeed. But with a little bit of luck, we should be able to get them into the fortress. because they are in the middle of the map, and that isn't an area that's completely surrounded by the noxious ooze that converts them into zombies just yet. So hopefully things go all right. Thankfully, the dwarves are very efficient at getting that trading depot that I ordered together, and I assigned a broker. Hylam was the dwarf that I chose for this task, and I did at the very least have one airlock, but it was right next to the center of the fortress, and also in an area that is extremely exposed. But once again, I'm crossing my fingers here and hoping for the best. And I give the order to tell the dwarves to open the door and pull the lever to unlock the drawbridge. Thankfully, Asmer is still distracted by one of them reindeers. This one isn't even a zombie, it's just a reindeer. Hopefully it stays that way. Swiftly, Snail came over and pulled the lever to get the drawbridge opening. And just like that, everything is open and we're fully exposed. There are a few cage traps in the way, just in case something gets through, but now we just have to cross our fingers and hope for the best. The outpost liaison is moving towards the fortress from the center of the map, and so is the trading caravan, with their 2 soldiers in tow, who will do their best to defend things, and could also become very heavily armored zombies. We'll just have to wait and see. The outpost liaison, who is the fortress representative, has made his way safely into the fortress, so that is all well and dandy, and I was able to unlock a door and allow him to enter the fortress. But with a quick click of the alerts, I can see that things are not all well and good. It appears that old S.E. Memer here has found the Mace Dwarf and the Axe Dwarf, 2 guards for the merchants. And with a little bit more inspection, they don't seem to be doing half bad. They're actually getting a lot of hits in, especially in the combat log. But they do seem to be doing a decent job distracting the creature. Enough at the very least that the merchants are getting a clear-ish line around the side. Perhaps things are going to end better than I'm expecting. But perhaps not. The first dwarf to become one of them was Aiton, who clearly isn't thrilled about this whole idea, because he's currently crying. As you can see, his eyeballs have tears equipped. As the fighting escalates, even though Aiton, the Mace Dwarf who's been turned into a zombie, will most likely turn against his friend and kill him when the fighting is over, at the very least they're still working together for the most part. And it appears that the merchants may actually have a chance of making it into the fortress safely, which is excellent news indeed. But I'm about to get extremely distracted by something, because, well, my population's not supposed to drop. What just happened? As I pan the camera back down towards the fortress, I quickly spot the issue. Final, who was one of the first dwarves I named, ironically, was found by yet another zombified owl, and is doing his best to whack it like a baseball with his pickaxe, as a smoke zombie. Well, ain't that great. Final is now one of them, and locked in eternal combat for the rest of the fortress, or until his appendages get removed and he ceases to exist, whichever happens first. Anyways, we should probably see if those merchants made it into the fort, right? Just gotta pan the camera back over to the side door and unpause the game again, and oh my god! What the fuck? How long were you in there? How did you get in there? Why the fuck did I let that happen? Oh, god damn. And after the initial state of minor massive panic, I had to inspect all my livestock and dwarves, and everybody's still okay, so that's good. But still, the important question is why did I let my guards slip so much that Lulma managed to get into the fortress? Such a sneaky bugger. Anyway, that puts you in a very inconvenient place, right in front of my merchants, who are still making their way towards the fortress. And let's not forget that the one remaining zombified guard is still locked in eternal combat with Asamemer. And by the time I scrolled the camera back to see what had happened to the merchants, it appears that Lamalma had kicked their face in so hard that their head exploded. Only one of them, though. The other one's still wandering around, most likely. And Lulma is now locked in an eternal duel with the yak, living up to their name at least. Kids are yapping, and Lulma is yakking. Where was I? Oh right, I should probably lock the doors, because this trading attempt is a lost cause. At the very least, we'll be able to do our diplomacy. Final was able to kill the owl. I guess that's good. Good for you, Final. And the Eternal Guard, aka Aiton, the Great Mace Dwarf, is still locked in combat with Asmer. And the one remaining merchant is deciding to take the absolute worst possible route off the map, directly towards the Titan and the Eternal Guard. Genius directions. They probably haven't installed Waze yet. Thankfully, they do have some skill in dodging. At least they're quick at learning, I suppose. And is mostly not getting hit by the projectile vomit, referred to by the dwarves as deadly spittle. But clearly, as you can see, has taken a good number of hits to the forehead, which has caused them to develop a fever. But I'm sure that'll be fine, right? Definitely not contagious. And as if it was in the nick of time, the Eternal Guard, Aiton, managed to defeat the Plains Titan by slamming it so hard in the forehead with his mace that the injured part was crushed, training up to a Grandmaster Fighter and Master Mace Dwarf in the process. I wish I had that steel mace, that'd be nice. But Dwarf's as good as dead anyway. I guess he'll hang around forever. Or wait, no. Where are you are you going to go kill the merchant? No. Oh my god. He's leaving the map. That means that the Eternal Guard is returning to his home, most likely to begin an infestation of abominable smoke zombies back at the mountain home, no doubt. I think we may have just caused the apocalypse, guys. The truly crazy thing is all of this has happened in the first 3 months, and I don't think it could have possibly gone much worse. This fortress has certainly started off hot. Maybe things will cool off a little bit. I don't know what else could possibly go wrong at this point, except for maybe that. Once every couple of months, once your fortress has been founded, the game sends you some migrants, and they have decided to enter the map in one of the worst possible locations. Not only is it actively raining, but there are pools of this goo stuff everywhere, and as I unpause, you can see them entering the map and immediately being converted into abominable smoke zombies. Even this bunny rabbit is going to go full psycho. Same with that cat, and the woodcutter, and I guess chaos is just going to ensue now. I don't expect a single one of these dwarves to make it into the fortress at this point. Even though the population has risen to 11, I just don't have much hope. None of my airlocks are completed anyway, so even if the dwarves had chosen a better place to wander onto the map, they would have had a very long walk to get to the center of it, and there's a lot of obstacles, which should be obvious at this point. Speaking of that center airlock, somehow I managed to catch 2 reindeer in my cage traps. So if anybody does survive, reindeer steaks are on the menu. Perhaps this bone carver will make it. Aerith, he's making a wild dash towards the fortress, but I shouldn't get my hopes up. Yeah, I was right to not get my hopes up. After standing in a contaminated tile, this bone carver is one of them. Now might actually be a good time for me to talk about ghosts. While these dwarves are zombified, they're considered alive. This means they can't become ghosts. Once the zombies are unzombied and are left lying on the ground gray and inactive, they can become ghosts, and will require the body to be buried, or a gravestone with their name inscribed on it has to be made and constructed. So whenever a migrant wave like this appears, I have to be ready to turn all of them into slabs. But here's the kicker. The game can only have a few thousand notifications at a time, and the list gets cleared if there's too many new ones coming in. And at this point we have a titan who is fighting with a yak, and now a dwarf who is strangling a dwarf. And because they don't need oxygen, they're gonna be here for a while. So what this boils down to is I'm going to have to be very, very quick about memorializing my dead dwarves. If I don't, the notifications are going to get cleared by all of the combat logs. So this fortress is just gonna become absolute agony. At least I don't need to worry about letting any of them in, because every single one of those migrants is either a zombie or unexisted. I guess I should actually work on the fortress, huh? It's time to finish those airlocks and actually begin digging around in the caverns. But we're not even safe down here, because my new home appears to be infested with giant toads. The dogs are doing their best to chew on them, but the dogs have been injured and are rather exhausted, so their attacks are very ineffective. I guess I should just quickly make a squad and get the dwarves to punch it to death. At least the dwarves are good at something. At the very least, by the time we get the next migrant wave, we should have all of our airlocks up and running, and I should have all of these dwarves memorialized, but I'm expecting this list to get a little bit unwieldy. We'll probably just have to deal with them as ghosts pop up. I've done a bit of work now, and these levers are what is connecting our airlocks together, so that system should be functional soon. And now the hatches are installed, progress is looking good. And as I've done before, I told one of the dwarves to go and dig a ramp going up to the surface. This is where those 2 dwarves are dueling and trying to strangle each other. Maybe the scent of fresh alive dwarf will encourage them to get caught in some cage traps. And the aptly named Snail has once again volunteered and completed the channel. With the door open, the 2 zombies tumbled down into the walkway and quickly fell into my cage traps, just as I'd planned. Thankfully, Snail made it out safely. And right as I was thinking that stuff was about to start calming down, a giant olm arrived. I should probably clean up that skeleton as well. Alright, dwarves, kick its face. All of this chaos happened in the first year of gameplay. It's only early winter, and I don't even have beds yet. The good news is, for the most part, the dwarves' spirits have been pretty good, until they started seeing ghosts at least. Then things started going downhill. I should get those dealt with. Everything seems to be going wrong. I also built a trading depot in a better location. Hopefully, we wouldn't have to worry about traders getting to the center of the map anymore, but I'm not going to get my hopes up. And I also started carving out some bedrooms, after almost a year of gameplay. Perhaps it'll be the pick-me-up that the dwarves need. One thing is for certain, this is one strange tomb. Indeed. Since I finally have a break in the action, I think now is a really good opportunity for me to remind everybody that these are all streams. All of the footage that you're seeing in this video was streamed live on my Twitch channel. Link is in the place where it always is. And if you'd like to see the unedited footage of these streams with my dumb face on it, you can find that over on my second YouTube channel, Blind Extras. These videos take a lot of production to put together, so if you enjoy this type of content and would like to see it continue to be made, leave a comment down below. And if you watched this video, you know what to say. Also, don't forget to leave a like, or a dislike even. Anyways, let's get back into the action. Since things were pretty calm in the fortress itself, just not so much on the surface, it was finally an opportunity to actually work on building the fortress. Because it was spring now, and the fortress was officially 1 year old, with a grand total population of 6, and a nice collection of undead things. Like these 2 murder reindeer that are trying to headbutt each other for all eternity. They've been do-si-doing for quite some time now. But at least we have bedrooms. I'm sure Snail appreciates this. And the airlocks have been coming along nicely. Most of the northern airlocks are completed. We are now just starting work on the southern airlocks, as well as carving out an artistic place for our tavern, storage, and crafting regions. Farming was also underway, but we had to keep the operation small due to the tiny little population, and I was starting to realize just how much aquifer was in this cavern layer. Most of it. We'll have to go deeper soon. And we were nearing mid-spring, having completed a lot of construction work, and quite a bit of chiseling. Moods were still not great, but they could have been worse. And then some migrants arrived. This was a problem because they arrived at the bottom most southern area of the map, about as far away from any of my airlocks as possible. But I remained hopeful and unpaused the game. But my optimism was quickly shattered, as one by one they all entered the map and turned into, well, you know what.
You got red on
So
you.
instead of beating myself up about it, I just decided to get back to work and begin finalizing those southern entrances. Perhaps at some point we'll get some migrants that arrive nearby one of my airlocks and they can actually make it into the fortress. That'd be nice. I could use a few extra hands around here. And I was getting tired of building all of these gravestones. But at least the fortress was starting to look like a fortress, slow and steady. We even had a tavern. I named it the Blockade of Dinner. Seemed fitting. But the construction work must continue. We needed kitchens and stills, and tables and chairs, places to eat of course. Quite a bit of time had passed, but we did get another migrant wave. This one arrived at the beginning of summer instead of mid-spring, and they arrived in almost the exact same spot as the last one. Needless to say, I wasn't hopeful, but I unlocked the door anyway, and the dwarves began running towards the entrance of the fortress at a pretty swift pace. And to my amazement, a dwarf made it into the entry walkway, shortly followed by a crew of other dwarves. I was ecstatic. So happy to see such a small crew of dwarves piling into my tight little space. So happy, in fact, I decided that the first dwarf to arrive was given a nickname, the Runner. A gem cutter and a pretty talented sprinter, if I do say so myself. So we gave the orders to open the door, and all of the dwarves entered the fortress, except for Runner. For some reason. I don't actually know why. She's just standing there. And after what felt like an agonizing amount of time, someone else entered the chamber. It was Final, and by the time I realized what had happened, it was too late, and I could no longer lock the door. Because Final was alive when these traps were constructed, he is unaffected by them, so he simply stood there, watching. And Runner somehow managed to avoid conflict. And after, again, what felt like an eternity, Runner started, running. Really fast, in fact, all the way across the Heavenly Wastes. I was freaking out at this point, kind of trying to figure out what was going to happen next. She ran through multiple shrines and temples, past many bodies and skeletons, and past dozens of contaminated tiles, until finally, Runner arrived at her destination, my airlock in the northeast. Literally crying with excitement, I unlocked the hatch cover and allowed her entrance into the fortress. It's good to have you, Runner. You bloody legend.
Woohoo!
Checking in on Final, he was moving back out to the surface, as is expected, frankly. He had a horse that needed whacking. Since it's not undead yet, you can't say that he's beating a dead horse, but he will be soon. Good luck, Final. More time has passed, and it's now early autumn, except now we have a lot more hands to get tasks completed. So I decided to increase the number of stonecutters shops to make more bricks, and I increased the size of the farms. Something was starting to bother me though. Look at all of these items. Right next to the Struggler and the Titan, locked in Immortal Combat, is a pile of items. This is the contents of the trading caravan that was dropped by this yak. I would really like to obtain it at some point, but we need this fight to end. Perhaps the solution will find itself, but for now, they just have to stay here forbidden. It's a shame, really. Thankfully, Strange Tomb is actually starting to look like a fortress. It is now early autumn, and the second trading caravan has arrived. Let's see if we have more luck than the last one. I unpaused the game and checked in on the outpost liaison, who was walking swiftly towards the fortress, the highest survival rate of anybody to enter the map, frankly. And he successfully made it to the northernmost airlock, which is where I'm hoping the trading caravan makes it to as well. Good luck, dwarves. I sat and I waited, and a weasel runs by. I see combat logs. That's never a good sign. I jump the camera over, and there's actually a zombified dwarf right next to them, seemingly ignoring them, however. And they're running north as swiftly as they possibly can. And the merchants have at the very least entered the fortress. I think they may have lost one of their guards in the process, though. And in the nick of time, I spotted Aerith, the abominable smoke zombie bone carver from before, who just about made it into the fortress. Thankfully, I spotted it. That's a relief. Plenty of time to lock the door. You stay there now. Don't you even think about it. As for the guard that they lost, he appears to be a crossbow dwarf and shot down a zombified eagle. Well done there, Rigoth. Here's hoping you make it off the map safely, otherwise it's going to be a short trip for you. As for the rest of the traders, they can easily leave through the caverns. I've even prepared a door for them. And as the trading was beginning, another migrant wave arrived from mid-autumn. This was possibly the best news I'd had in a very long time in this fortress. I'm not going to lie, I was getting kind of down, because they arrived in the best possible place, right next to my recently completed third northern airlock on the west side. I was ecstatic. Before I could unlock the doors, I just needed them to be standing in front of them so I could let them in safely as a group. And immediately, the first dwarf runs to the passageway and stands next to the hatch. I was so happy. And then this duckling entered the map and did the same thing. But then, moments later, something horrifying happened. This adorable little chick showed up and stepped right here. Yeah, so that's completely infected with abominable smoke, and this cute little adorable chick is now infected. The good news is, the cute little chick doesn't seem super interested in actually fighting with the dwarves. And I just sat there slowly counting as the number of dwarves rose, and then suddenly they started running out. Something must have been spooking them. Oh, that's probably got something to do with it. And as the dwarves began piling out of my vault entrance, they started fighting with the chick. And also, of course, the giant titan who shoots webs. Great. More dwarves continued to enter the map, but things would just go downhill from here. I was about to unlock the hatch and let the dwarves into the fortress proper, but they'd all left at this point. It was just a duckling left in the containment chamber, and they were all fighting with the titan. Opening up the fortress at this point wouldn't be worth the risk. None of them were getting infected yet, but it wouldn't take long for that to change. The resulting massacre was devastating. I practically just kind of held my hands up and watched through my fingers. I didn't even want to see it after a while. And as the final few dwarves fell, something genuinely incredible happened. Remaining alive was a bunch of children, a blacksmith, a chick, and a duck. And suddenly the titan fell. I presumed it was one of the children, but upon further inspection, this was not the case. Solon, the duckling abominable smoke zombie, bit the hill titan in the head, and the injured part is torn apart. Meaning, this duckling killed this titan by biting it. That might be the most incredible piece of Dwarf Fortress combat I have ever seen in my life. I don't care if this duckling does anything of note after this, that was incredible. In any normal situation, this titan would have steamrolled every single one of these creatures. But, because this is Dwarf Fortress, we now have a duckling who killed a titan the size of a semi-truck. Oh, he also killed the chick. You know, the one who started all of this in the first place. Good riddance, really. I guess you deserve a nickname. How about Darkwing Duck? Now, I'm sure the dwarves inside the fortress are not fully aware of what's going on the surface, but they can most certainly hear it. And as the founder of our fortress hears the rumbling off in the distance, giving orders to the other dwarves, I think they're quite satisfied with what they've built, and the runner also seems to be settling in well. It's good to see. We have to look at the small things in this fortress, frankly. Some of them very small with a build. I knew I needed to find the deeper cavern layers, so I constructed another drawbridge and made it look fancy, and then started digging downwards. Discovering the other 2 cavern layers was very simple. This is a very shallow map. It's only about 60 layers deep. We found the center cavern layer in no time, and designated constructions to limit access to the wild creatures. Just for, some precautions. And a couple minutes later, I found the 3rd cavern layer, the deepest of the 3, populated with all of the lovely red trees, and purple cave moss. And the dwarves stumbled upon some pools of lava, which I'm sure we'll make use of sooner than later. While all of the digging was going on, we also were installing cage traps around all of our airlocks, just in case anything did get in or I left a door open at some point, because there was kind of a lot of zombies. The dwarves had survived another winter and were entering into spring once more. And despite the danger, some more insane dwarves decided that it might not be an absolutely terrible idea to move here. I can't possibly think as to why, but I'm sure you can, because having watched most of this video so far, it's quite obvious why moving here is a bad idea. Not that that's ever stopped any of these dwarves. For these dwarves, it looked like things were going to go okay initially, so I optimistically unlocked the gate. But by the time I looked back over, that initial mechanic who walked onto the map was running away in fear from something. Turns out that donkey that also entered the map got infected almost immediately, and crushed them with their hooves, or whipped them with their tail, or whatever donkeys do. And as Gordon Ramsay would say, "You fucking donkey!" And as I would say, all that this really needs is yakety sacks, but I fear the DMCA. So instead of continuing to follow that dwarf, who is probably going to get turned into something horrible that's opposed to life in any moment, I jumped over to the peasant instead, who had recently entered the map. No, not this peasant, who was already a zombie, having been bit by Chucky and Darkwing Duckling. This peasant, who is actually seemingly moving in the right direction, at least until they saw the struggler and the titan fighting, and sprinted away in fear. But by some stroke of luck, they then rerouted around the struggler and titan, and began to head north. Back over with the other migrants, things aren't going so hot. It seems like Darkwing Duckling is doing his best to up his kill count. Or maybe this child will do all of the work. I'm not quite sure here. Jumping back over to Suxul the Peasant, it seems that they have changed their direction once more, and are now heading back south again. I guess the struggler and titan are scary after all. And by some miracle, it appears that Suxul has actually made it to the fortress, so I quickly locked the gate behind them. At least we've had some success here. Back up in the northeast, it seems that this child actually did the majority of the unlifing, so I gave them a nickname, Chucky. Seemed fitting after all, considering their entire family was what they offed. And Chucky is now doing battle with Darkwing Duckling, although Darkwing Duckling doesn't seem to be particularly effective in this matter. Best of luck all the same. The child could probably kill the duckling if it put its mind to it, considering Chucky punched a dwarf in the head so many times that their face collapsed. A little grim, to be sure, but not nearly as grim as the zombie baby. Whenever this happens, I just kind of feel bad. Alright, Missy. Best of luck out there. Deep down below, I had some other projects I wanted to complete. I found this mysterious wall studded with gems, so I started sealing the whole area off. I wanted a safe area to collect those diamonds. The easiest way to keep dwarves from going nuts is by having very valuable spaces in crafts. And it may shock you, but having an abundance of rubies, diamonds, and emeralds does absolutely help increase the value of items once encrusted. So I figured I would harvest as many as possible. And because the population is very slow, I need to defend us from threats. And that's why we are walling everything off down here. And on the topic of keeping dwarves happy, we also need to finish that tavern and build our dwarves a temple. Nothing like a little bit of indoctrination to keep dwarves satisfied with their lives, or at least terrified and in submission. It seems that the deer have been partially replaced by a herd of elk, which are quite a bit more effective than the dwarves were, it seems, and our diamond mining operations also seem to be going quite well. And as I was digging around those gems, I spotted this. It's a spot with some water behind it. Very wet walls. So instead of mining directly through it, in case there was a torrent of water behind it, I told the dwarves to smooth the wall, and then chisel a hole, normally intended for arrows or bolts, which allows liquids to freely flow through the wall. And quite quickly and efficiently drained out the extra water. Lovely. A season has passed since the last attempt that the dwarves made to join the fortress, and so it's time for another. And despite the danger, more of the silly migrants have arrived, but they are pretty close to one of my northern airlocks, so I pull some levers and get the doors opened, and hope for the best. This round, to my astonishment, was actually quite successful. The dwarves made their way quickly and efficiently towards the ramp heading down and into the fortress, and the population climbed quite a bit, from 14 all the way up to 18. I'll take any success I can get at this point. Welcome to the fortress, you new bastards. We need extra hands to help us with this diamond mine. Just above where the dwarves were mining out the diamonds, I also instructed them to cut out a large area. This would allow us to do some concussive mining. Essentially, the way this works is in the center, I will put a support. And then one layer above, I will tell the dwarves to channel out an open space and remove all of the dirt around the edges supporting it, so that when I connect a lever with two mechanisms to this support and then give the lever a pull, it'll destroy the supports, causing the whole thing to collapse and destroying one whole layer worth of blocks. It's just a very efficient way of clearing out space, if you know that there's something potentially below it. And over to the side, I designated a side entrance, which will be locked off with drawbridges and gates. The idea behind this is if anything evil comes out of those gems, aside from, the standard greed and gluttony and copious amounts of wealth, then those scary things could potentially take this side entrance out and onto the surface. And then if the surface doesn't deal with them for me, then they will deal with the surface for me, if you catch my drift. But the dwarves still had quite a bit of digging left to do, and that, of course, takes time. And for the third time in a year, a fresh round of immigrants have arrived. And just like the last round, I opened the gates. I'll be honest, I was getting a little bit cocky at this point, kind of presuming success. And I was pretty much correct. Every single dwarf made it in, except for a lot of their livestock, which joined the zombie hordes. And as the last few dwarves filed in, a couple zombies came running directly towards the entrance, including Final. These zombies cleaned up the livestock that the dwarves were bringing to the fortress, including a pig and a donkey, and then got caught in my cage traps, which I was pretty pleased with. I was so confident, in fact, that I left the gate open long enough for a third zombie to enter the fortress, and then get caught in my cage traps. Because I'd constructed these cage traps after they were zombified, they were not immune to them, and my stockpile of zombies is growing. Potentially, these could be used as weapons in the future. But for the moment, the dwarves had more pressing matters to attend to, such as making more bedrooms, and finishing that side tunnel. This would operate almost exactly the same as my airlocks, with a drawbridge and a door to stop things from getting in and out, unless I deemed it necessary. And as this construction was nearing completion, the runner entered into a fey mood. Because the runner was a gem cutter, that was the task that she would take on. She claimed the gem worker's shop, and very quickly grabbed some rough pyrites, and began working furiously. As the runner worked on her masterpiece, I was keeping an eye on the dwarves completing the side entrance, and a few final rounds of bedrooms. And once all of the digging was completed, the runner finished her artifact. And she named it Idas Begigian, a pyrite bed, and offers it to the strangled weasel, a gift from the runner to the fortress. This is a pyrite bed. All craftsmanship is of the highest quality. It is encrusted with trillion-cut pyrites. And honestly, I think that the runner deserves to keep this as her own. I don't know how it could possibly be comfortable, but it's definitely the nicest bed in the entire fortress. And to celebrate, it was time for some fireworks. And the dwarves locked the gates, leading into the diamond mine, and opened the gates, leading to the side doors, and then pulled the lever that breaks the support structure, and the floor collapses. The dwarves couldn't see it, but they could certainly sense it. They could almost hear it, a high-pitched ting. They must have found adamantine, praised the miners. For a place with no metal, adamantine was just that much more important to the dwarves. But they also heard rumblings, which must be a treasure of the gods, and then dark growls. A grim sound from the distance. Something evil must be emerging from the newly exposed pockets. What emerged was something the dwarves could only imagine. An ecru devil and a mole monster. The ecru devil was a gigantic iguanodon who could expel a powerful deadly dust, and the mole monster was a giant undulated toxic mole. Terrifying creatures which quickly moved to the surface. The ecru devil ran quickly to the center of the map, while the mole monster got distracted by the various reindeer scattered about. The ecru devil clearly had a mission, and it was to end the struggling of the struggler. A few moments later, after sustaining some heavy wounds, killed Lulma, the great titan. Perhaps now I could acquire those items, which is good news indeed. Moments later, the devil headed south, attempting to acquire a second legendary kill. But this fight was too much for the devil, and it met its match, and was crushed under the weight of the giant web-spitting bunting. Up north, the mole monster was still picking away at the various reindeer who'd been scattered around the map, and was making short work of them. Zombies or not, it would strangle them for a bit, and then eventually gore them to death. But it appears that Chucky wanted a piece of the action, and ran down and joined in the fighting. Of course, Chucky was a mere child, and what could it do against such a great mole monster? Besides, it was very distracted by the reindeer. Chucky's younger sister also decided to watch from the sidelines. The two zombie children did their best, but eventually, the mole monster had other plans, and Chucky was crushed by the claws of the mole monster. By this point, the dwarves had closed the gates, leading down to their diamond mines, planning to get back to digging as soon as they finished their additional bedrooms. Perhaps soon they would have more hands to help complete these tasks. Sometimes Dwarf Fortress is downright spooky. Chucky had only just been unexisted from the zombie world, and his father has returned to visit. I presume that this means that he's welcoming him into the afterlife, whatever that means for dwarves. We'll have to get them both memorialized sooner than later. I'm probably also going to have to embiggen this slab room at some point, because there's going to be a lot more ghosts. I haven't memorialized half of these. We'll get to them when we get to them, whenever they pop up as ghosts. Thankfully, we have those extra hands, as I mentioned earlier, and the diamond mines must continue to be chipped away at. We're also continuing to make lots of bricks and are using them to fill in holes that could lead into the caverns. We wouldn't want anything escaping. The dwarves used similar strategies to the water for removing lava. They channeled down from one layer above, letting it all flow out and into the caves, turning any water it touches into evaporated mist or obsidian bricks. This is about the safest way to do this, and while it's not perfect, it's going to minimize the possible torching of dwarves, and it gives us a break to work on things upstairs, such as finishing off this temple and making it look all pretty. I had some time to kill while I was waiting for the lava to dissipate, so I actually got my dwarves training. I took all of my miners and assigned them to a squad, and then I told them to use pickaxes as their weapons. We were about to start forging actual weapons out of the iron ore that I brought, but I just wanted them to have a different activity to do for a little bit. Once all the lava had cooled off and turned into stone, the dwarves did their best to get all of those gems mined out and constructed another support to use for some more concussive mining. The whole process was going rather smoothly. With the extra hands, now was a good time to get the dwarves working on some forging. First they made charcoal, and then they took the refined iron bars and melded them with dolomite, which you can see scattered about. This then produces pig iron, and then you combine iron with pig iron and some more charcoal, and you get a steel bar. The dwarves had enough iron ore to make enough steel to make almost a full squad worth of armor, with a little bit to spare, which they were going to use to pump lava, but more on that later. That's a bigger project. For now, the dwarves were still worried about migrants getting into the fortress. Even though the steps of opening the airlocks was becoming quite routine, it always managed to go wrong somehow. And while some dwarves moved across the map safely, others got ambushed by this angry weasel, or just simply walked somewhere with infected snow and went berserk. Somehow, despite the odds, a couple of the dwarves always managed to make it into the fortress. Although, let's be honest, every single time this happens, their moods get worse when they first move in. Because by the time they make it through the front door, they've already seen some stuff that they will tell stories about probably for the rest of their lives, however short they might be. But once they're in the airlock, it's just simply a quick flick of the lever, open the drawbridges, and let the dwarves in. Welcome to the fort, newbies. One of them took the name Zacher, after somebody from Twitch chat. It's always nice to get to name more dwarves, and develop new main characters. Speaking of, Snail is still around, and enjoying telling all of the newcomers his poetry. I'm sure they like it. While the poems were being told, the expedition leader founder was very far away, clearly not even remotely interested in the poetry. Much more interested in making steel, however. And, of course, some steel corkscrews. The time had come to mine out some more gems, so the dwarves got back to work, but they'd clearly made a calculation error somewhere in their chipping away, because suddenly all went silent, and then became louder than any dwarf could imagine. They had unlocked an echo of forgotten divine retribution, an angel from the time before time, a remnant of the world's creation. Lachid's Slayer Hammerman, which was composed of ash and had a round shell, and its exhale rattled maniacally. I guess I used to live next door to one of these. My old chain-smoking neighbor fits this description perfectly. The actual discovery of this was an accidental cave-in that was caused from some careless mining designations by yours truly. The creature wielded a two-handed maul made of blistered metal. Definitely something worth taking a look at if we get the opportunity to melt it down. But first, I'm concerned for the safety of all of my dwarves. The blast from the cave-in knocked Tapioc, my bookkeeper, directly into the lava, causing him to burn to death. And for the rest of the dwarves, I decided to cut my losses. Thankfully, they were all able to scamper out to the exit, which gave me some time to close the gate and hitch a plan. We placed a cage with one of the zombified dwarves in it, Servesh. Once constructed, we connected that to a lever, and then released the zombie from the cage, using the lever that we connected it to. Servesh, the abominable smoke zombie, inchwormed his way across the ground because he'd lost both of his feet. Once he slithered over, he quickly dispatched the angel, so fast you may even miss it. But how, you might ask? Well, he bit him in the head, and then shook him around so hard that his head sailed off in an arc. Quite the chompers you got on there, Dwarf. Unfortunately, he also obliterated the poor hunting pupper who got stuck in there after the dwarves made their escape. Honestly, it's a shame, really. But aside from the unfortunate end to the pupper, the dwarves still wanted to honor this zombie, so we gave him a nickname, Headhunter, for his ability to chomp and bite heads. Thankfully, catching the zombie was trivial, to say the least. We simply baited it with a yak and a bunch of cage traps. The zombie took the bait and fell into the cage. Then all we had to do is reopen the back gate and get back to work. Behind the scenes, the dwarves were enacting several other plans, but these I will leave until the end of the video to discuss exactly how they function. It involves breaking space-time and a lot of physics, but just know, for right now the process includes pouring a bunch of lava somewhere so that I can pour water on it. Once completed, things are going to get a little gnarly. And honestly, I'm looking forward to it. I'm sure the dwarves are as well. In the meantime, the obsidian that we dig out of it will make some nice accents for the fortress. Aesthetically, I think it'll complement it well. Sometime later, the fortress had an interesting visitor, who may have been hiding just out of sight for quite some time. This is Anan, the Terrible Curses. The reason I say that they've been here for some time is they have 100 kills. And as you can very clearly see, all of these kills were committed on this fortress's property. It's very kind of the Forgotten Beast to chronicle such things. And it seems to have been quite busy. It's good to know that we have an acting janitor in the fortress. The population has also climbed enough that we have reached Guildhall status for our stone workers, meaning there's 10 dwarves that have this skill. I'll put something together for them. Hopefully I don't dissatisfy. But aside from that, most of the routines stayed the same in the fort. I did try my best to use other techniques to get dwarves into the fortress, such as using priority zones, but didn't have much luck with that, frankly. Every migrant wave, a couple dwarves would get into the fortress, and some would just die to this murder cow. Zombeef, I'm calling it. And the dwarves were becoming threatened from all fronts. Even inside the fortress, creatures lurked. After another unfortunate mining incident, an ape monster emerged, who expelled toxic gas. A rather large beast. This time, the first person it encountered was Hylam, who had become my broker for quite some time now. One of the first dwarves to enter the fortress, an honorable death, but still an avoidable one. This was entirely the fault of mine. Hylam was able to get a couple valiant hits in on the creature before it shredded him. A shame. Then proceeded to charge Insulina and Lobster, my mechanic. Insulina was quite skilled at mining, and was able to get a very, very skilled, well-placed hit directly on the ape monster's neck with his pickaxe. This caused the ape monster's throat to explode into gore. A great success. This does not scare me, says Insulina. I was curious to see if the ape monster was butcherable, but after building a butcher shop and unforbidding the body, the job auto-cancelled. I guess it was just too mangled. It's a shame. Regardless, I needed a better garbage disposal solution, so I had the dwarves dig a hole leading directly down to one of the lava chutes, and I set it as a garbage dump. Then I put a pressure plate just north of it, and set it so that dwarves will trigger it, and my citizens will trigger it. And it's repeating, not a single-use thing. This is then hooked up to the grate, which causes it to open and close as dwarves walk over top of it. This means that creatures from down below that could fly, or climb, can't climb up through it, unless it happens to be open at that exact moment. It's a nifty little system if you ask me, and I think it works quite well. My forges also desperately needed an upgrade. Even though I'd worked through most of the steel making I needed to do, I didn't want to keep having to chop down trees because frankly they're quite limited in this fortress. And because lava was so close by, I simply moved some lava up and underneath where my forges were to rebuild them as lava forges. It uses less fuel. The added speed to my forging allowed me to fully equip a squad with steel gear and spears. Some of them still needed their helmets, but we were just about done with it. The one thing left to do was find dwarves that were fit for the job. I did have a population of 44 at the time, so I did have quite a few to choose from. Although it's weird to be 5 years into a fortress and not have enough dwarves to elect a mayor. As the soldiers continued equipping their new gear, I decided it would be time to give some of them some more names. Because frankly, what's the point of having soldiers in a video game like this if you don't get sad and cry when they die? And naming things is the best way to get attached to stuff. And out of all of the options I had for names, I decided to take longtime community member, retired Navy vet, and throw his name into the list. Because he sounds like a soldier, and this dwarf's personality perfectly suits being in the military. I think he'll do the job just fine. As I was renovating the fortress, I also founded a second squad. This one was going to be comprised of Mark's dwarves, just in case we had a forgotten beast made of fire or something. There was also a dwarf that I had to remove from the military, and that was Entropy. Entropy liked training in the military, but was also the most pissed off dwarf in the fort, and actually was tantruming earlier on, but was slowly crawling back from the brink. I was pleased to see his recovery, but he still had a long way to go. But for the moment, I was just happy that my dwarves actually had their weapons together, because we were starting to get attacked pretty frequently by forgotten beasts, such as Yonali, this huge feathered dragonfly. Frankly, that's a badass sounding monster on its own, but it does have deadly spittle. Fortunately for us, it was rather distracted by this giant Olm, who unfortunately got thrown into the lava pit. Imagine getting this as Sparta'd by a giant dragonfly. It swiftly moved towards my militia, who had been ordered to kill the creature, but made a very careful, clever decision. You see, forgotten beasts don't need to breathe, and for dwarves, assuming they're still living, breathing is kind of important, just like you or I. And that armor is very heavy, and dwarf have stubby arm and is very dense, not very good at swim. And in the chaos of the fighting, one of my recruits, Kogan, was punted into the water, and the beast followed them down in a moist pursuit. After crushing what remains of the poor recruit, Leaving their body and the brand new forged set of steel armor lying at the bottom of the water, the creature climbed back out, where Romanoid and retired Navy vet began to duel with the beast, swiftly slaying it. Retired Navy vet was the victor, and he acquired his first kill, the first of many, I can only presume. Now, it was imperative that I got that body out of the water. A lot of the time, I would simply leave it and let it rot, and memorialize it with the rest of the slabs. But I needed that steel, because it was very limited. So I told the dwarves to dig a lot of the rock out of the caverns, and I built a pump. And then I did some shenanigans. The simple version is it's similar to the concussive mining I was doing before, but instead of just dropping the floor, I'm dropping the whole wall piece. Aside from that, the procedure's the same. Remove all the supports, dig one layer up, channel around the edges, remove everything else, build a support, connect the lever, and pull it. The result is a chunk of wall falls and remains solid, assuming it doesn't fall through the floor, which it won't do if the floor beneath is solid. Now that we had the little area dammed off, the one thing left to do was turn on the pump. The dwarves pumped all of the water out, and we retrieved all of the metal armor and the body, which we'd newly prepared a coffin for. Things in Strange Tomb continued to progress at a pretty rapid clip, and aside from a couple unfortunate burning incidents, the unaliving numbers were actually relatively low during this time. However, it had been a while since they'd successfully traded, and it had been almost 2 years since their last successful migrant made it into the fortress. And all of this progress got me kind of cocky. I wanted to try and make contact with the goblins in the overworld. I thought it would be hysterical if they actually were able to invade us. Worst case scenario, if they try to invade us and all turn into zombies, they would then go back home and start self-destructing their own faction, which would also be kind of amusing. This would help spread renown and bring more migrants to the fortress. We could also try and make contact with the other dwarven faction, which was populated after my last fortress in the region finished, but they are a different faction from us. But it might still be a good way to acquire some wealth. Founder hitched a plan. So I renamed my Mark's Dwarf squad, which only had one dwarf in it at the moment. It was Insulina, the dwarf that killed the ape monster not so long ago, and renamed the squad to the Grim Messiah. The idea being that this group of dwarves, or in this case, dwarf, would be the bearer of bad news, the bringer of the apocalypse. We will demand tribute from the goblins, which they will surely deny, but it will tell them our location and encourage them to invade us. Good luck, Insulina. Make the fortress proud. But this surge in dwarven activity would have an unforeseen consequence. The dwarf Insulina successfully left the Heavenly Tundras and had began his 2-day trek to the goblin strongholds, in the areas surrounding the cursed place that the dwarves lived. Someone had been watching and had seen the dwarf leave. He was a collector of sorts, a preserver of well-renowned artifacts, by whatever means necessary, of course. He had heard tale of dwarves in this area a long time ago, but hadn't realized there had been a resurgence in activity. He decided to bide his time. It's best to wait. Dwarves' forges often burn out, inevitably, as that is the will of Armok. Just a few mere days later, Insulina returned. I was ecstatic, but now the hard part. We had to get Insulina back into the fortress. So I unlocked as many of the airlocks as I could muster and set up a station order for Insulina. And after running away from some very scary reindeer a few times, Insulina ran north, attempting to get into the most northeastern airlock. But this time, instead of seeing some scary reindeers, they instead saw a zombie weasel off in the distance. Equally spooked, Insulina ran towards the center of the map, which was not the entrance they ended up taking, because they saw something scary. I didn't even see what it was. They then ran north again and went to the trader entrance. And after that wild goose chase, successfully made it back into the fort. But I didn't unlock the door. Instead, I simply assigned a new order to tell them to go and request tribute from the local dwarven faction. This was a temple that got populated after I ended the last fortress in this region, presumably by some of the refugees from there. I sent out the demand with hopes that I could get another trade caravan. I may have had ulterior motives, but regardless of the goal, Insulina followed the orders and left the map once again. A few days later, he returned once more, and again, successfully re-entered the fortress. The situation was promising. We had made contact, meaning I would be able to have 2 attempts to trade this year, although the founder of the fortress had other ideas. I'm sure the rest of my military was getting jealous of the success of Insulina, because at this point they were just glorified Crundle hunters. I'm not even sure how they're getting into the fortress. After a short period of respite, I had another mission for Insulina. This time I wanted him to raid the goblins. And, like the good dwarf he is, he obeyed. But we didn't hear back. A few weeks went by and I checked the world map. Once I hovered my mouse over the place that I told Insulina to attack, I realized we'd messed up. The goblins had captured him. There's only one solution to a problem like this, and that's simply send another dwarf. The Grim Messiah shall have an heir, and it will be Imush, one of my more talented militia dwarves, albeit a little bit rusty. I selected them based on their skills. They actually had some skills in ambushing and tactics, which helps when trying to take over a location or attack something. And once again, miraculously, the dwarves returned. And frankly, there was no bad news here. Imush had returned with all of her gear, and alongside of her was Insulina, the fortress hero. Not only had they successfully snuck in and freed our dwarf, but they also stole some livestock. This beak dog. The best part about this success is they re-entered the map right next to one of my airlocks, so I quickly unlocked the door. The dwarves made it down first, and patiently I waited for the beak dog to join them, only to realize I'd made a horrible mistake. You see, something was wrong. The beak dog was turned before making it into the fortress. My two soldiers were okay, but the beak dog was not. And because Insulina had been captured, he'd been stripped of his armor, and was a sitting duck for the beak dog. After putting up an incredible fight, was killed, instead of becoming a smoke zombie. Imush loosed as many bolts as they had in their quiver, and then ran through the door, locking it behind her. That beak dog and those goblins would pay. They would pay in whatever they had. At this point, Founder was acting on vengeance, and the other dwarven faction that the dwarves had made contact with did in fact arrive to trade. After letting them into the fortress, consumed with greed, Founder had a plan. You see, when contact is lost between dwarves and their homeland, new migrants cease to arrive. Strange Tomb hadn't acquired a new migrant in almost a year and a half. They needed wealth, but their artifacts simply couldn't be sold, and the gems were too valuable to part with under any circumstances, for they didn't earn them or deserve them. The steel armor was a rare thing to come by, so the dwarves needed wealth from somewhere else, and instead of trading or crafting, they decided to take it. They placed a cage with a zombified donkey in front of the trading depot. This problem could surely solve itself. After connecting it to a lever, they released the creature. The result was an obvious success. The donkey lashed forwards, biting and writhing towards the dwarves. Dwarves may be cousins, yes, but even amongst the dwarven civilizations there is a hierarchy and competition. And when materials are limited, the desperate sometimes do desperate things. The surviving merchants scattered, and the dwarves let them leave. Why keep them? They wouldn't make it home anyway. The dwarves disposed of the bodies and gathered everything from the trading depot and placed it in their stockpiles. It was also time to upgrade the trash. I automated it with a minecart. I have a tutorial if you'd like to see how to do that. I'll stick it in the description somewhere. These dwarves weren't evil. They were simply paranoid and scared, acting on instinct. But such actions can anger the gods of old, and the dwarves started seeing omens everywhere, such as the feeling the dwarves got when Darkwing Duck was struck down by Vlad the Impaler, the zombified porcupine. But on the topic of bad omens, have you ever opened your cupboard and been struck by the number of mugs you have stored in there, and thought to yourself, I don't even remember getting this mug? That's a telltale sign that your home has been infected with a mug goblin. Reclusive and rare. Most of the time, the only evidence of them is a new mug in your kitchen. It's probably best to not go specifically looking for them, because they have been known to induce screams of horror. Luckily, they are mostly benign. All documented evidence points to them adding mugs to your cupboard on a regular basis, and there was that one homeowner who was crushed under a sudden avalanche of mugs, but we haven't been able to confirm that was actually a mug goblin. Don't fear, however, for we at blinddirl-shop.fourthwall.com have come up with a solution. Mug goblins can be appeased. A happy mug goblin poses no threat at all. How? Acquire all of the mugs you can, and stock your cupboard with all of them, until no unexpected new mugs appear. You might have to stock multiple cupboards, just to be sure. And don't forget the often forgotten cabinet, next to the stove that stores your muffin tins that you never use. You know you are safe when a mug goblin is satisfied with the mug population in your home, because they will make you a cup of coffee. But be warned, do not drink this cup of coffee. For while the mug goblin has fine taste in mugs, it is confirmed that they do not know how to brew coffee, and it will taste terrible. If you think your home has been infected, don't hesitate to reach out to myself, Blind, here on YouTube, and let me know down in the comments section. And of course, visit blindirl-shop.fourthwall.com and pick yourself up a limited edition mug with these glorious images of the blockade.
Only the black one's limited edition. The white one will stick around forever. All of this is a work of fiction. Mug goblins do not exist. Mug goblins can't hurt you. Do not feed the mug goblins. Please buy my mugs.
God damn it, I just spilled bean water everywhere. Ow! My head, what was that? Something came over me. What the hell happened? Well anyways, Founder kept to herself, at least as best as she could for the next few months. She had a lot of thinking to do. There were more gems that needed to be mined, and they needed more hands to complete that dangerous task. And as time went on, they did begin to arrive. There was always a few losses. Inevitably, a lucky few would make it to the center and enter the fortress. Founder considered this to be a hazing ritual of sorts. Those who survived the surface were worthy of living in Strange Tomb, and the rest were simply far too weak. But they were thankful to have the extra hands on board, because the Founder wanted something, so she made a demand. She required the items left behind by the long-lost caravans. The process was simple. Dig a hole beneath it so that it would fall straight down, and then dig up underneath it and cave the floor in. On the surface, it worked flawlessly. Once the digging was completed, all the dwarves had left to do was place a wall and fill in the cracks that they had created in the space that they had just dug out. However, they were not as quick as the undead, and only moments after the digging was done, before the dwarves even had time to request some bricks be placed, Founder could tell that a problem was about to ensue. She just had this feeling. And as if Armok himself was mocking them, Meng, the wood-burner abominable smoke zombie, was entering the fortress. She had been here for some time and knew exactly where to run. After sprinting down the stairs, she locked herself in combat with the dwarves. It was a calamity. First, she killed Fractal and infected one of my miners who went by the name Crabapple, who was able to take down the zombie. However, he himself was now infected, and retired Navy vet came running in from the sidelines to fight with both the recently infected Yak and Crabapple. After putting both of them down, he too became one of them. A fully armored, well-trained, invincible monster. He began sprinting towards the livestock, shredding everything in his path with his spear, skillfully ending anything that moved, and infecting the rest. Dwarves were falling left and right, but many of the dwarves had found refuge underground and had sealed off the entrance to the cavern levels, so it was possible the fortress could be saved. But for the rest of the dwarves who weren't so lucky, it was a bloodbath. And even after Navy took some injuries, he kept fighting, simply getting more skilled as the seconds passed. But enough of the dwarves had fled the halls that Navy decided to move back up towards the rest of my yaks in their large pasture, and fought his way through the barracks. It was here that I saw an opportunity. When he turned around to re-enter the fortress, I locked the doors, sealing him inside. In terror, I released the dwarves, and did a quick head count. The population had gone from 60 to 48, an absolutely crushing defeat. But all that we could do, before any more zombies could enter the fortress, the dwarves sealed off the surface once more, and captured retired Navy vet in a cage trap. The rest of the dwarves got back to work, mostly putting pieces of the deceased away, and constructing a large number of coffins, which I guess is a benefit, because up until this point, most of the memorials the dwarves received were simply gravestones, and their bodies were left to rot. It's not much of an improvement, but we have to take the wins where we can get them. The work was grueling, but thankfully, word about the fortress was continuing to spread, and rumors of its danger were not. Some more migrants had arrived, and the population climbed to a much more reasonable amount. It may not have been their former glory, but they had risen back to 57. The dwarves continued to bury their dead, and disposed of those who were no longer considered one of them. But not everything was going as planned. There were forgotten beasts that were stronger than the dwarves expected, which continued to weaken their military. They needed an alternative. They decided to take a page out of one of the history books that they had acquired, which spoke of a creature called the Blockade. These dwarves used these zombies as weapons, as a method of defending themselves against unstoppable hordes. They hoped a similar effect could happen. So they took retired Navy vet's cage and placed him in a hallway. They sealed this space off with a door and a block wall, and connected the cage to a lever. Once pulled, Navy was released. This would restrict access to the caverns, but they could always catch him again if needed, and hopefully, he would deal with the beasts for them. As the following year passed, not much of note happened. Aside from the usual chaos, of course. But the dwarves were mostly focused on making their home livable, such as expanding the tavern and clothing operations, and making sure everybody had a bedroom. They were also working on their secret weapon, which I'll get to very soon. Because the dwarves had dug deeper, quite a bit deeper, in fact. They had even found adamantine, and successfully began to harvest and manufacture it. This is the lightest and sharpest material known to the dwarves, but rumors have suggested that digging it could be dangerous, and the dwarves had a weapon to defend themselves against those dangers. A fully automatic, repeating railgun built out of impulse ramps. Alright, time to put on the tutorial hat for a second here. Let's explain how this thing works. So you can see it running right now. These minecarts are going abnormally fast. What I'm doing is I'm tricking the game into thinking that the minecarts are actually going downhill, which causes them to accelerate. The mechanism that I use to start this is these rollers, which are at the end. I could have extended the rollers all the way along on both sides, but honestly I got a little lazy and just didn't. The minecarts themselves are made of steel, making them very heavy, and getting hit by one of these is the equivalent of getting smacked in the face by Crazy Rocket Man on YouTube going full throttle. So let's start at the beginning. The reason I flooded the whole area with lava was because I'd constructed these mechanisms here. They're made of dolomite, which does not melt when it touches lava. The reason I did this was because I wanted the mechanisms to not be accessible from the outside. But I did want to connect the mechanisms to the rollers. By pouring lava in the space that they already occupied and then water on top of them, it sealed them inside of these obsidian bricks. After that, I channeled a space beneath them and let the water from the cavern here flood through it to power the water wheels, which are connected to the mechanisms. When I channeled down the space, with my miners, I left these ramps in place, and I also dug out the level above. Then I went along and created these corners, and deleted the extra pieces on both sides of the minecart track. I'm not entirely sure why this works the way it does, but this side will make them go north, and this side will make them go south. I don't have a visual representation of them going left and right, but that does work as well if you want to set up a similar system. And at least in my case, this always takes a little bit of trial and error, because I find these finicky to set up. Once everything is completely filled in, I add my rollers and make sure that they're connected to my water wheels. I then install several drawbridges on top of the tracks to act as sort of an on-off switch. Once everything is in place, the dwarves place the minecarts on the rollers. And then all we need to do is pull a lever, and the minecarts get the zoomies. Now don't let any of your dwarves stand here, because they will just turn into red smears on the ground. These things could kill a bronze colossus, any forgotten beast, or frankly, anything else that's stupid enough to get in their way. But the dwarves are digging, and omens are watching. It's time to go deeper. They weren't entirely sure what they were looking for, aside from more of the fancy adamantine, but they knew it when they saw it. The dwarves broke through a corner brick, and horrifying screams echoed from the darkness below. They had done it. They had found the location of the underworld. But not far away, another creature was approaching, albeit slightly to the south. The eruption from the underworld could be felt like a volcano, causing a great earthquake from miles away. And the Collector felt this, and knew it was time to approach. But he wasn't taking the fortress on directly. Instead, he was using Godly Tombs, which was a fortress that fell some 30 years ago. He'd never been here before, but he had read about it. He'd done so much research into the dwarves who'd lived here, because he collected artifacts, and there was something here that he needed in his personal collection. Rumor has it that the dwarves of Godly Tombs trained zombies to defend themselves, and one of those zombies became unstoppable.
And his name is John C.
No. His name was the Blockade, the last line of defense for the dwarves, and he had a shield, which was made of wood, which he gave a name. The Collector wanted that shield. He wanted it for himself and his personal collection. But the Fortress of Godly Tombs wasn't a small place, and this was going to take some time. Meanwhile, peering down the hole, the dwarves of Strange Tomb had to act quickly. Monsters were already pouring out of the holes that they had created, so they opened up the side doors, hoping they would encourage them through their traps. With the way open, the dwarves released the zombies, or at least the ones who they had prepared for such an occasion. And humorously enough, at this moment, the goblins thought it would be a good time to invade. However, the dwarves never even noticed. You see, the goblins had been attacking them for some time, but the second they would enter the map, they would get rained on and become zombified. Moments later, they would defect from their own military and scatter into the wilderness. Eventually, they would work their way back home, so in a way, the dwarves' plan was working perfectly. But not too perfectly, because one of the demons managed to get past the zombie line, and the dwarves had to face it head on. It was a Cinder's Brute, a great beetle capable of hurling balls of fire, but it didn't ever get the chance. The dwarves executed it swiftly, and the goblins continued to just be plain silly. Blink and you'll miss it. A lot of the demons weren't super interested in flying. Apparently they couldn't. No fault of the dwarves, but it was making things a little bit tricky. They needed more coaxing, clearly. So the dwarves thought they would train up their zombies a little bit by giving them some donations. Then after that, they walled the section of fortress off, so it wouldn't be a concern to them. Then they opened up the gates, and the abominable smoke zombies gladly accepted the donation. And it seems that the commotion had an effect, because one by one, the demons began to climb to the surface. And good old Final, the zombie from the beginning, decided to begin exploring downwards. So did Tourist, who the dwarves referred to as Thing Number 1, another one of the earliest zombies. Thing 1 fell quite swiftly, but Final put up a bit more of a fight. As the hordes emerged, he quickly put down not one but two eyeless devils, these small ones that he's fighting currently. Then Final simply waited, because they would approach him. The owl demon took flight and did battle, and was too much for old Final. By the end, he had no legs and no arms. Plus, most of his upper torso was missing. I honestly have no idea why or how he was still holding that pickaxe. But he did, up until the very end. Rest well, Final. You were a real one. As Final passed, some more of the demons began to climb out of the hole. One by one, they filled the space. Clearly, their contraption was intimidating them. Not a bad secret weapon, if I do say so myself. Some of the demons explored the rest of the space that was available to them, but most of them simply, suspiciously, looked at the minecarts. Until the horse fiend, who killed the zombie Ice Blue, made an attempt. The minecarts ricocheted repeatedly off of its body, smashing him into the slate wall. The other demons did not seem super enthusiastic, once again, about following in hot pursuit, even though there was dozens of them. The dwarves did have an ultimate plan here. They wanted to build a stairway down into hell itself. And since the demons didn't seem particularly interested in assaulting the fortress, at least at this moment, they decided to take the opportunity to go mine some adamantine from one of the other diamond spires. There was 3 that were accessible to them after all, that they had spotted in their exploration, and they began digging. But they chose a wrong place to mine. Apocalypse. We are being judged by the gods. The dwarves had released an ancient archdemon. It was a towering turkey composed of mica. It had 2 long, straight tails, and it returns surrounding light with a new vibrance and intensity. It was created by the human goddess, typical Theram, the apex of jades, and it is part with the day, light, minerals, and the sun. Wait, the sun? That is a deadly laser. We can tell from the get-go that this thing ain't gonna be friendly. And it wasn't friendly. After turning the miner that discovered it into a mashed potato, it power flapped directly into the fortress. Because I was digging in a side area, I didn't have walls set up or drawbridges pre-prepared to block off any problems. A bit of a miscalculation on my part. The creature entered the living space of the dwarves and proceeded to execute just about everything it saw, except for that ghost, because, well, it has no substance. But Founder remained alive and vigilant, and as the bloody turkey went to go kill one of my cave crocodiles, the dwarves locked the door and began to clean up their dead. Seemingly an endless job at this point. After a couple of minutes, the dwarves began to regroup and set up a drawbridge and some walls. They were going to release this creature to the surface. Maybe one of the titans would deal with it for them. After digging the necessary tunnels, they unlocked the door and released the creature, and gave it access to the surface. And the Doom of Stad was happy to oblige. It quickly exited and flapped off into the sky. It was blissful to once again witness the sun in which it was born from. As a god among the dwarves, it would fly off in peace, while also eviscerating everything in its path. Everything behind it would be peaceful. No longer breathing, but peaceful. The dwarves presumed eventually this creature would die to one of the remaining titans, but they had bigger problems to attend to, because their fortress was still mostly full of demons. Meanwhile, slightly south, the Collector could feel a strange chill in the air. which could only be described as a bizarre sense of warmth. Something had been released into the air. He'd had no luck finding any sign of the blockade, but he had a pretty good idea of where he needed to look. He was slowly crawling down the inside of the shaft that had been dug by the dwarves who once lived here, and he peered down below. Exhaling, he let himself fall. The adamantine was too slippery to get any kind of grip on. And there it was, just to his left, the blockade's shield and the skeleton of his old friend. He had spent decades studying this site and the creatures that had died here. He felt like he knew the blockade as if he was a personal friend. But the collector didn't have a way out. There was no way back up. But he had a hunch that he would find a way if he just simply headed north. Against their better judgment, the dwarves were still digging through the adamantine. Why they kept doing this is kind of a mystery. However, they continued to find these giant monsters, who continued to shred them to pieces. Thankfully, the dwarves had gotten slightly less stupid in their endeavors, and upon discovering this slate gray devil, they had already prepared some airlocks to seal the creature in. It would work nicely with the airlocks they'd already built. However, this also included sealing a whole bunch of dwarves in with the creature, and none of them had weapons. Thankfully, the casualties were relatively low, all things considered, and so the dwarves released the slate gray devil into the hole with the rest of the demons. And unlike them, it didn't have that primal fear of flying minecart, and moved into the rattling space that the dwarves had prepared for the creatures, getting mashed and smashed and bashed back and forth, like as if he was a ball in a table full of pins, whatever that means. But much to my surprise, and I'm not even doing a bit here, he made it through, which was actually shocking to me. Every other entity looked more like Swiss cheese upon exit, whereas this one seemed to do just fine. Admittedly, he was bleeding a lot, but still, he made it out. All the way to the surface, in fact. And after exiting, he started fighting with a bunch of the stoats, and finally killed Murderbeef, and executed a bunch of the remaining zombies, and then got into fights with elk. Well, I suppose you're just strong enough to live there now. Starving Graves the Evil. Maybe you'll do battle with the Titans or something. I'm gonna worry about cleaning up these bodies. At this point, I don't know how the dwarves were feeling. The numbers didn't say that they were feeling great, but I was feeling pretty annoyed. I wanted to defeat the rest of the demons, and I think the dwarves would probably have agreed with me. And if they liked the surface so much, frankly, they could have it. It's not like we could live there. So I tried to get as many of the remaining coffins built as possible, so I could do my best to keep up with the remaining unalived dwarves. This was an initiative led by Pubble, my broker. The founder, frankly, didn't care at all about the dead dwarves. The founder was much more interested in Navy, who was still occupying the caverns. He had mostly been cleaning up Crundles at this point, and the occasional giant rat. The founder wanted the dwarves to recapture Navy, presuming he could conquer hell for them, so they obliged. They built some tunnels, set up some traps and a couple doors for good measure, and tapped through the wall. Navy swiftly fell into their trap. All they had to do now was set up the cage as they've done before, and connect it to some levers, and then open the doors and release Navy. And slowly over the next couple weeks, and I literally mean couple of weeks in-game, Navy skulked towards the demons. He really took his sweet time. I'm not even lying. I literally cut hours of gameplay in this section, until eventually, a curious eyeless devil challenged Navy to a duel. Skillfully, Navy put the creature down, and then stared down the remaining demons, as if challenging them. But then, Navy charged, and was immediately launched towards the wall, slamming into it and losing functionality of his lower spine. Moments later, the horse fiend bit his head off, and Navy fell. The dwarves had enough. The demons were terrified of their minecarts, and their brightest and finest had been crushed. But the founder of Strange Tomb had one final trick up her sleeve, and ordered the dwarves to pull the lever in the tavern, which they had prepared some time ago. This lever created a hole from the surface to hell, and the resulting collapse crushed many of the demons who had been standing petrified by the swirling minecart blades. It must have enraged them, because they rapidly populated the tunnels that surrounded the shaft. The dwarves realized that they may be in trouble, so they sealed off their stairs, blocking off all entry to the surface, and in doing so, lost access to all of their airlocks. The dwarves were locked underground, with no way out, and the demons rampaged through their fields and herds of yaks, ripping and tearing their way through everything that stood in their path. It wouldn't take long for them to move to the surface and occupy it as their own. The dwarves of Strange Tomb were accepting in this. They couldn't have the underworld, but they couldn't live on the surface. They hoped that the result of their burning fields and the screeching skies is they could move below, and perhaps they could populate the underworld, given enough time. The remaining titans fell to the demons, and so did the last few zombies. The Red Devils were particularly fun to watch, because they created lines of melted snow wherever they traveled. One of the longest to exist zombies on the surface, and the mother of 3 children, and 2 of them remained in the fortress. She fought with many horse fiends, as if she was fending off a herd of demons. She lasted for quite a long time, longer than most, in fact, until finally her soul left. And honestly, it was a relief to see many of these zombies ended on the surface. Founder thought so, at least. They had suffered for too long, not dead, but not alive, just simply soulless. I could tell, because Founder was feeling empathy. Even though she had lost a leg in the fighting against the Doom of Stad, she was still here for her citizens. And they were still here for her, having created a gift, an adamantine pickaxe. It was created by Mistum, the waxworker, and they called it Kalan Rasuk Atast Kurlig, and offered it as a gift to the Founder. And somewhere, not so far away, someone was walking towards the fortress, and knew exactly what he wanted to collect. Because of course, who couldn't resist acquiring an adamantine pick when all craftsdwarf is of the highest quality? It is encrusted with tapered baguette cut picture jaspers and encircled with bands of adamantine and square brilliant cut amber opals. This object menaces with spikes of chalistony, and on the item is an image of a forgotten beast. We don't know which one, we forgot. This marks the final moment that I had in Strange Tomb, my second attempt at playing a satisfying fortress in the worst map I've ever found in Dwarf Fortress, against all odds in an impossible scenario. I have to say, I think it went better than the first time in some ways, but in others, the first was more dramatic. The lack of the underground hordes was a lot less of a challenge, and made it much harder to train my zombies to be a threat against the demons. Settling as close as I did to the original fortress also seemed to cause some oddities. In fact, I think that's the reason why the demons just kind of stood there, instead of, walking into my blades of death and getting eviscerated before working their way up to the surface. But aside from that, I enjoyed this fortress, and I will miss it. I had a great time playing it. And the story is over. Or is it? The Collector was lost. He didn't know which way he had to go, and he was starting to get desperate. So when he encountered a group of Red Devils, he figured he would ask for directions. What frustrated him was in previous trips down into the underworld, everything was hostile and would simply attack him. But he would also get responses from other entities when he asked for directions. This time, they just stared at him, blankly, not responding. In order to enter the Fortress of Godly Tombs, he had to cross the heavenly tundras, and unknown to the Collector, he had begun to ooze abominable smoke, meaning he could no longer communicate with any other entities, living or dead. Enraged, he executed the creature, and satisfied with his work, he threw its body into one of the strange holes that bubbled with odd colors of other worlds, and then continued his journey, exploring as best he could and avoiding the demons that were concerning threats to him, until eventually he spotted 2 bodies. This was the sign that he needed. He was almost there. As he had crested the next hill, he found a pillar with some stairs next to it. Surrounding the stairs was bones and gore, caused by some calamity that happened quite recently. Pause. I know that somebody in the comment section is going to be like, you didn't build those stairs. Yeah, I know, I didn't. I reloaded the save, and I used DF hack to make them, okay? I needed this for story purposes. Just let me have this, okay? Just this once? Alright, let's continue. The Collector jumped after making a mad dash and grabbed onto the stairs, because they were surrounded with lava. Thankfully, he was able to grasp the wall instead of sailing on by and catching flames, and he began to climb the stairs. As he surfaced, he heard this bizarre rattling sound. Upon closer inspection, there were minecarts moving faster than he'd ever thought possible. These dwarves certainly have some engineering prowess, he thought to himself before beginning to head towards the gates. He could feel the presence of an artifact that had been created recently, and wanted it for himself. He was used to violence, and wasn't expecting the dwarves to be particularly helpful. And he entered the fortress only a few moments later, but was met with nothing but hostile aggression. His suspicions were correct. He had been cursed. Damn this place, he thought. Damn this place. He tried to reason with the scholar and chased him south, but it was no use, so instead he resorted to his normal violence and began slashing at anyone who moved, looking everywhere for the artifact that was only a few minutes old. Slashing, cutting, and ripping until he saw it, an adamantine pickaxe, held by a dwarf who screamed that they were the founder of this fortress and to stand down. It was beautiful. It would go nicely with his shield of the blockade in his tower back home. He cut his way through the founder before moving to the dwarf who stood behind her. He hated dwarves, almost as much as he hated humans, but nowhere near as much as he hated goblins. Thankfully, there would always be more goblins, so that hate could go on for a long time. And as for the elves, he didn't think much of them, thankfully, but he was tired and just wanted to leave this damned place. So he rummaged through the pile of fleshy liquids and gore and fished out his prize, the adamantine pickaxe. Put it in his backpack. Brave dwarves, he thought to himself. I shall remember them fondly when I write books. That's what he was thinking to himself as he executed the scholar. Because he wanted to write this novel, he wouldn't permit anyone else to do so. Leaving some dwarves alive to cower in fear, he worked his way down the stairs and realized he'd made a mistake. He was unable to leave through the front of the fortress because the dwarves had sealed the exits. And he couldn't leave through the underground because he jumped in godly tombs, so he wouldn't have a way out. He was very strong, but could not fly. He spent a long time watching the minecarts fly by until he made his mind up. After all, he was a legendary dodger. He would just simply step out of the way, and confidently he began to move forwards through the tracks as the minecarts rattled past, until that fateful moment when the minecart collided with him, shattering his spine, removing his head, and ending what remained of the collector necromancer, urist, fearcrafts. Some dwarves still remain in Strange Tomb. They'll live on. They have the shield of the blockade, as well as their adamantine pickaxe. They have the technology to create unstoppable weapons, and more guards on the surface than any fortress could ever hope for. Founder has fallen, but a new heir will take her place. Strange Tomb lives on, in its own way, secluded and isolated, far away, with only the memory of those of you who watched this video, to spread their story around the known universe. And as for the map, you can still download it if you want to play it. I'll leave a link to it in the description. And for me, I'm never playing this map again, because honestly, it's kind of hell. Unless I'll have to think about it. And thank you very much to you. Yes, you. Those of you out there watching this video right now. I wouldn't be able to make this video if those of you out there weren't watching it as you are right now. So thank you. And if you saw the first one, you know what to leave in the comments section. I kind of hinted at that earlier on anyway. But for right now, I have a lot of these. If you liked this one and you haven't watched the other ones, go watch part 1. It's probably the recommended video that's going to pop up at the end of this. And if you haven't seen the rest of them, I've got many hours of entertainment. If you're interested in playing Dwarf Fortress, you could watch my streams at twitch.tv/BLINDIRL or here on YouTube. If you want to support me directly, there's all the usual ways. But over on my website, I have a very Patreon-like solution where I get 100% of the profits. I don't give any cut to anybody else except for Stripe's transfer fees, which are pennies on the dollar. Aside from that, I hope to see you in my streams, because that's what keeps these videos funded and where all of the VODs are created, and it's how I get all of the footage for these videos. And now, I won't take any more of your time. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you watch the next one of these that I make, and I hope to see you in my streams. Until then, I'll see you sooner than you might think. Pum pum. Pum pum.